Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English, and we turn now in your hymnals to page 518, 519, and here in a few moments we'll be over on page 528, 529. We'll be working with the Pete Hamill text, Library's Face Sad chapter. Now before we get there though, I'm with you on page 519, and I want to remind you that we are focusing at level 2B, that rhetorical level, not what a text says but how it says it, and our literary analysis topic, persuasive essay. Now again, we're going to compare this essay with a text that we have already talked about, the Dolan text, Carry Your Own Skis. These are persuasive essays, and what makes them persuasive? Well, let's get this in our notes now. When I write to persuade, I'm not writing to change your opinion or your mind, but rather I'm writing to challenge your opinion or mine. Write that down at 2B. Persuasion is not about trying to change someone's mind, right? Carry Your Own Skis is not about trying to change your mind. No. We don't change our attitudes so easily, but rather to challenge you to consider an alternate view. For example, dude, I think I've lived most of my life letting other people carry my skis, metaphorically speaking. I'm going to begin to try to carry my own skis. I'm going to demand more of myself. Do you got me? That's challenge, right? Okay? And the way that's done is of two kinds. Look at it with me on 519. The writer can appeal to reason, right? Logical arguments, verifiable evidence, facts, statistics, expert testimony, or can appeal to emotion, right? Statements including charged language, words with strong positive or negative associations. Jot down really quickly already, where would you put Carry Your Own Skis? Would you see it as an appeal to reason or an appeal to emotion? A lot of my readers will say, honestly, that's kind of more about emotion, isn't it? It's a powerful statement. It's basically saying, dude, if you don't carry your own skis, what's wrong with you? That's an emotional argument, okay? Of course, we're also going to be evaluating this persuasion by studying the thesis and the validation. We're going to ask about the argument, whether it's credible. We're going to ask whether it's comprehensive. We're going to ask about generalizations. And we're even going to use that graphic organizer at the bottom of the page on 519. Now let's turn to this text, Pete Hamill's text, Library's Face Sad chapter. And I'm with you on 528. We're back to our question again for Unit 3. Is there a difference between knowledge and understanding or wisdom? I think most of us are beginning to argue, yeah, I'm starting to see a major difference between those two things, right? Look at the vocabulary words there at the bottom of 528. Make sure you know those in anticipation of both your reading of this text and, of course, our assessment. Let's meet Pete Hamill for just a second here. Notice, born in 1935, still is alive. He has had 2 novels, right, on the New York Times bestseller list. But he's first and foremost a journalist. After quitting school at 16 to work in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Hamill joined the U.S. Navy. He completed his high school education while in the Navy. In 1960, Hamill went to work as a reporter for the New York Post newspaper. Let's put this in our notes. How many of our writers started out as journalists? A whole bunch of them, right? And it makes sense, doesn't it? For 2 reasons. They spent a lot of time playing with language, and they spent a lot of time around people. And so they understood what people needed to hear or wanted to hear. Although he would write for several of the newspapers in his career, Hamill loved his job at the Post. He wrote, quote, "Nothing before or since could compare with walking into the New York Post at midnight, being sent into the dark, scary city on assignment, and coming back to write a story," end quote. Under the Do You Know stuff, during Hamill's long career as a reporter, he covered wars in a number of countries, including, you can see them listed, from Vietnam to Nicaragua to Lebanon and North Ireland. Now the background for this essay is huge, so let's take a look at it. Again, the title is Library's Face Sad chapter. Although the first American library was established in 1638, it was not until the 1800s that public libraries became common in the United States. Since then, Americans have come to rely on public libraries as a free source of education, entertainment, and community. Let's say 2 things for your notes really quickly to give a little bit of prior knowledge. It was Benjamin Franklin in the great city of Philadelphia who actually invented the idea of sharing books. Of course, back then, books were a commodity and a precious commodity. And it was Ben Franklin and his pals who began to say, let's exchange books. And, of course, invented that great library that's still there in Philadelphia. Number 2, I'm lecturing this essay in the summer of 2018. And it is true that now libraries are beginning to increasingly become less and less used, frequented. In fact, I recently heard a student say the only thing he knew about the public library was that's where he got his free Wi-Fi from. It didn't have anything to do with the books in the room. It had to do with the utility of the Wi-Fi, which I think speaks volumes to what we're talking about. But there may be a reason for that. Watch this, watch this. Almost all the books in a library now can be found, most of them for free, online. They don't need to go into a bookstore or into a library. Having said that, though, let's ask this question, and I'm going to help you here as we get ready to read this. So write this one down. Question: what is the sad chapter? And the word sad in the title is a fascinating word. Sad chapter, right? We normally think of sad as a very emotional kind of thing. Well, of course, how can libraries, rooms that contain books, be sad? Well, it might be that the libraries aren't sad, but rather, of course, something else is sad. We'll get to it. But this question is an important one, and it will be this one. Write it down. In what ways in this essay do libraries symbolize something about America? Okay? In what ways do libraries symbolize something about America and who America is? Right? So here we go. Let's go ahead now. Pay attention in our reading to this text, Libraries Face Sad Chapter.
Libraries Face Sad Chapter by Pete Hamill. The library was 4 blocks from where we lived, on the corner of 9th Street and 6th Avenue, and it was one of the treasure houses of our Brooklyn lives. This was in the years before television, when we saw movies once a week at the Minerva, or the Avon, or the RKO Prospect, and fed our imaginations through radio and books. That is, it was in a time when the Count of Monte Cristo was as vivid in our minds, and talk, and dreams as Jack Roosevelt Robinson. Dumas told the story of the Count as vividly as Red Barber recited the unfolding tale of number 42. We passed into that library between 2 mock Corinthian columns that gave the building a majestic aura. For me, every visit was an astonishment. There was a children's room, first seen when I was 8, where I first read the wonderful Babar books, and then moved on to Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates, and all of Robert Louis Stevenson, with those rich, golden, mysterious illustrations by N.C. Wyeth. There were bound volumes of a children's magazine called St. Nicholas, full of spidery drawings of animals that talked, and villains who didn't. There were picture books bursting with images of lost cities or the solar system. In that room, I learned that the world was larger than our neighborhood. And then, at 10 or 11, I found my way into the adult stacks to borrow books about the daily life of the Romans, the flight of Richard Hannay across Scotland, the conquests of Mexico and Peru, the cases of Sherlock Holmes. On a high shelf, presumed to be safe from the curious eyes of children, was a lavish, in memory, edition of the 1001 Nights. No teacher sent us to those leathery cliffs of books. Reading wasn't an assignment, it was a pleasure. We read for the combined thrills of villainy and heroism, along with knowledge of the vast world beyond the parish. Living in those other worlds, we could become other people. Jim Hawkins, or Edmond Dantes, or, most thrillingly, D'Artagnan with his 3 Musketeers. We could live in the South Seas, or Paris, or the Rome of Caligula. It never occurred to us that we were inheriting our little share of civilization. But that's what was happening. Built by Carnegie. The library of my childhood is still there since 1975, known as the Park Slope branch of the Brooklyn Public Library. It was built with grant money from my favorite capitalist, Andrew Carnegie, in 1906. But once again, as happened in 1992, the teeming, imaginative life of libraries is in danger of being curtailed. Services might be cut, hours trimmed, staff reduced. The reason is the same: money, or the lack of it. Such reductions are absolutely understandable. As we all know, Mayor Bloomberg has more than a $4 billion shortfall that must be made up. Unlike the spend more, tax less leaders of the federal government of New York City can't print money to keep things going. In this season of post-September 11th austerities, something must give. I hope it isn't the libraries. The reason is simple. In hard times, libraries are more important than ever. Human beings need what books give them better than any other medium. Since those ancient nights around prehistoric campfires, we have needed myth, and heroes, and moral tales, and information about the world beyond the nearest mountains or oceans. Today,
533.
with books and movies more expensive than ever, and television entertainment in free fall to the lowest levels of stupidity, freely circulating books are an absolute necessity. They are, quite simply, another kind of food. We imagine, and then we live. Hard times are also an opportunity. Parents and teachers all moan about the refusal of the young to read. Here is the chance to revive the power of the printed page. The Harry Potter books show that the audience for young readers is potentially immense. A child who starts with Harry Potter can find his or her way to Dumas and Arthur Conan Doyle, to Mark Twain and Walt Whitman, and yes, to Tolstoy and Joyce and Proust. Immigrants' appreciation. For those without money, the road to that treasure house of the imagination begins at the public library. When I was a boy, the rooms were crowded with immigrants and their children. That is, with people who came from places where there were no libraries for the poor. With their children, they built the New York in which we now live. Today, the libraries of this city are still doing that work. The libraries of Brooklyn and Queens are jammed with the new immigrants and their astonishing children, the people who will build the New York of tomorrow. The older people want information about this new world and how to get better jobs and green cards and citizenship. Their American children want to vanish into books their parents cannot afford, thus filling themselves with the endless possibilities of the future. They are no different from the Irish, the Jews, and the Italians of my childhood. My father only went to the 8th grade in Belfast. I remember my mother drilling him at our kitchen table for his citizenship test, and I know that he first read the Constitution in a book borrowed from the Prospect branch of the Brooklyn Public Library. Lying in a darkened bed off that kitchen, I first heard the language of the Bill of Rights. That process must go on in all the places where the poor now live. If it's impossible for the city to do it, then we must do it ourselves. Bloomberg can give us the hard numbers, explain the shortfall in the library budget, and explain how much we need. Then, we should try to make it up with the establishment of a private fund to maintain the libraries at full strength for the duration of the crisis. All of us whose lives have been affected by the treasures of public libraries could contribute. The rich could emulate Carnegie, who used his wealth to create more than 1,600 public libraries, including 65 in New York. But the middle class could also send in small amounts, from $10 to $50. This would be a kind of voluntary tax. On one level, it would be a powerful pledge to maintain the life of the mind among all classes in this city. That is obviously in our own interest. But above all, it would be a means of honoring the labor of those men and women who got us here, and who paid taxes to buy books for all New Yorkers, and first took us by the hand and walked us into the treasure houses. We who dreamed of Ebbets Field and the Chateau d'If on the same American nights owe debts to New York that we can never pay. This is one that must be honored.
All right, let's start really quickly by talking about the organization of this essay. And we haven't really done this very often before, but let's do this together. Notice that you've got, and literally I'm now just working at level 2B. Notice that on page 530, you've got the title, Libraries Face Sad Chapter. which obviously now that you've read the essay, you understand why. But notice over on page 532, you have a title that we'll call a heading, built by Carnegie. Do you see that? Then over on page 533, you see the other one, Immigrants' Appreciation, right? You can actually use these two headings, and now that you know the essay especially, you can look back and realize that we're giving kind of a little bit of a heads up about what's coming. Make a note to yourself at 2B. Good readers, whether you're in an English class, a history class, a math class, a science class, good readers know how to look at these headings and scan them before you ever even start reading to get a sense of what's coming, okay? And I'm telling you as freshmen, that as you get into your study in math class, in science class, in history class, they're going to be making these points that A, you need to be reading some stuff, and B, when that stuff is broken up by headings, you want to be paying attention to those headings. Now, having said that, let's go back to the beginning of the essay and notice how much of this essay is about the past and the present and comparing between the two, and then finally finishing with an expectation of the future. Notice everything is built on an assumption here in this essay. Write this down. Everything is built on an assumption. What is the primary assumption of this essay? Well, some of you will say the primary assumption is that we need libraries. Nope, that's not actually the primary assumption. The primary assumption is something even more important than that. Humans long to use their imagination, and reading is the way that is done. Reading is central, in other words, to who we are as American people. And when he finishes with his comments about Carnegie that we'll get into in a moment, there's a reason why that's such an important name. Because this was a man who had billions of dollars and could have spent it all on himself and instead built, among other things, libraries. But why? Why are libraries such an important part of what it means to be an American? Because America is made of all kinds of people. And all of those people need to be able to use their imagination. Notice the use of the word imagination at the beginning of the essay when he's talking about what he was like as a child. And notice that at the very end of the essay he will say, we can use our imagination to solve a problem that we have, namely an economic problem. Of course, now we're going to go to the actual essay itself. How about the fact that he 2 times in this essay, write this one in your notes because this is important at level 1, mentions libraries not as libraries but as treasure houses. Let's jot down why that's an important symbol. The key symbol of our essay is the idea that libraries are treasure houses. What does that mean to you? Well, treasure, of course, carries with it the idea that there's something monetarily involved, right? Treasure, immediately you think of some kind of lots of gold or something like that, right? And yet notice in this essay he will say money funding is what's keeping us from having these treasure houses. Notice, as a good advertiser might, the first thing that Hamill will do is to talk about why libraries matter. And notice he begins first with himself personally. He talks about how it was all about his own reading at libraries. And then he goes to everybody else. It fed our imaginations. Later he'll even talk about intellectual reading as food, which is a very interesting idea that we'll have to maybe take a look at. He gives a great list of the different kinds of readings that he was a part of on page 351. And then he says it in his thesis in the 3rd paragraph, last sentence. I hope you're reading with me on page 531. I learned that the world was larger than our neighborhood. There it is. That's a key line. We want to make sure we got it. Why do libraries matter? Well, I don't know. Why does reading matter? Because, I have students that will ask me this, dude, why are you so excited about reading all the time? And there it is. Well, when you learn to read, you learn that there's a bigger world out there than the world that you know. Well, why should I expand what I know? Because that's called being alive. That's called growing. That's called evolving intellectually, right? Let's continue. He says that around ages 10 to 11, he discovered adult books. We could obviously here in a second ask at 3B, when did you discover adult books and how did it affect your life? Of course, for him, 1001 Nights, the great stories. He'll mention a little bit the importance of myths, right? Notice he says, this will surprise some of you, no teacher sent us to these leathery cliffs of books. reading wasn't an assignment, it was a pleasure. Why? Because it was a time before TV, right? A time before when you had to feed your imagination a different way. Now, of course, we can make the observation that for some of us, reading has been supplanted by watching and playing. And it does beg an interesting question. Can you say the same thing about a good video game that you would say about a good novel? And gamers are always quick to point out, no, gaming is better than any book, because you not only are reading, you're experiencing, you're engaging, and that kind of thing. Of course, let's point out this, though. The people who invented those games themselves are voracious readers. That is a fascinating reality, because where do you think they come up with all of those different game storylines? Well, of course, those storylines have got to come from somewhere. When, for example, we start doing readings of the ancient myths, it's fascinating how many of those old storylines end up in the games that we play. It feeds, it's symbiotic. In other words, we don't have to see gaming as, I game, I don't read. Maybe we would say it this way: gaming is a type of reading. Think of it that way. Gaming is a form of reading. It's a way of experiencing. But just because you game doesn't mean you can't have other forms of use of the imagination as well. Namely, of course, in reading and in engaging in text, right? Okay, let's go over to page 532. The first heading, built by Carnegie, right? He's going to make an observation. The library of my childhood was there since '75. The problem is now simple. There's not enough money to maintain the libraries. He's going to come back to this. Notice he does mention a little bit of politics when he talks about how after 9/11 and the attacks in New York and, of course, Washington, D.C. and on the Pentagon, he says America kind of changed and things started to become prioritized-wise a little bit different.